here is our final video. We have the national media. Front page news of the Times generally serves as a model for broadcasts of evening news, and the New York Times is still to this day considered the number one aficionado when it comes to political information. Besides that, probably the second would be the Washington Post. Now, when we look at the media generally has three major roles. They're gatekeeper, scorekeeper, and watchdog. Now, gatekeeper is a little more insidious than you think, and to this a little bit, it does lend credibility to some of what President Trump says about fake news and stuff. One of the things that they can do, because there's six major media corporations globally, they can control the information that we actually receive. Now, luckily, thanks to the internet, there is some stuff that can be circumvented now, but for the most part, the general public will only receive what the media wants them to know. As scorekeeper, they kind of decide who wins or loses. If you've ever watched a debate, normally they'll kind of do a rundown after the debate and they'll explain who was victorious, who, came out on top on a particular topic, and so on and so forth. Finally, a watchdog, they decides which candidates to be critical of. In other words, they will follow the candidates and they will, uncover garbage, media, scandals, you name it. And again, it can make or break a politician's career. Now, rules governing the evidence. Anything goes so long as the evidence is clear and convincing and was not printed maliciously or with reckless regard for the truth. So if it's truthful, the press can technically do it, put it out there, and go nuts with it. You also have what's called the equal time rule, and this is an FCC rule that states if a broadcaster sells time to one candidate, it must sell equal time to the other candidate. Now, that doesn't mean the candidates have to buy it, but in other words, it has to be offered. So if you get one program, like let's say Fox, which tends to be much more conservative than a lot of the other candidates, and Fox offers it to a Republican candidate, they must offer it as well to Democratic candidates running it as well. So in other words, it just means that the offer must be made, but it doesn't necessarily have to be purchased by the other candidate. Now, with campaigning, target markets today are easily reached again by television. And television, again, the odd thing is the politicians spend millions, if not billions of dollars on this. And again, it's still not clear whether or not it has a direct effect. But generally, those candidates that do spend more money do end up winning. And as a result of this, we get one of the things that's happened is we get what's referred to as horse race journalism. And essentially, it's a new coverage that focuses on who's ahead rather than on what the actual issues are. And so, again, it's kind of like bracketing. You see here on the Time magazine cover here where it's bracketed all the little guys, the candidates, like it's the Sweet 16 tournament event or something like that, or the SEC bowl game. Now, bias in the media. The majority of the media is liberal and tend to be secular. And again, that's simply because, again, you have generally people with a greater education tend to be more liberal when they do tend to be secular. But this does not mean it's always 100%. Again, like I said, Fox tends to be more conservative and also more religious when compared to a lot of the other stations out there. Now, technically, they're supposed to be neutral. Routine stories are events largely covered by reporters. You have what are called feature stories, which those that are not regularly covered, and then you have insider stories that are not usually made public. Okay, so like a feature story, Ford, which almost you could say is routine. President Ford apparently had this terrible thing of falling down all the time, and it actually became a running joke on Saturday Night Live when Saturday Night Live initially aired. Insider stories are generally stuff that's not made public and generally scandalous to a certain extent until it's leaked out by the media. Now, when we look at newspapers do tend to be biased and they generally reflect the bias of their readers. Okay. And one of the other things that we end up seeing with this is what's referred to as selective attention occurs when the media only pays attention to the stories that its viewership believes in. So again, this is where we also get kind of an action of a gatekeeper again, where the newspaper is only going to release information that is what you really want to hear based on your actual political party. And again, today the newspapers still tend to be very biased in that regard as to far as who they're actually going for. Now, government in the news. We also have government manipulation. One of these is what's called trial balloons. So trial balloons occur when the government leaks information to the media to test public reaction on a possible policy. So in other words, it's not that they're really going to go out there and say it or do this, but they kind of get a feel for it. So for example, here you see the trial balloon when Crist in Florida was going to run for the Senate in 2016, and it really didn't go over well because you can see the little air slipping and leaking out. Okay, but think of it that way, as it's kind of a blurb they throw out there, and then we end up seeing the politicians see what actually happens, and it's a way to kind of gauge what will happen if they go full blown on a particular issue. Another thing is that politicians tend to use what's called loaded language. In other words, they will use specific language to manipulate or say something to persuade the viewers without necessarily making a clear argument. One of the things, for example, that George W. did a few years ago in talking about Social Security, he kept referring it to the retirement benefit. In other words, by softening the language and saying retirement benefits more often than he said Social Security, it had more appeal to a lot larger audience, especially the elderly. Okay, now we also have public reaction. The press is generally seen a lot of times as adversarial, and this is the tendency of the national media to be suspicious of officials and eager to reveal unflattering stories about them. Again, probably the one that really did it, you can see pictured here, is Woodward and Bernstein, who these were the two journalists that broke open the Watergate scandal, which led to Nixon's downfall. And this really kind of became the foundation and cornerstone of adversarial press. Most Americans do dislike biased journalism, but remember, it's generally they don't like the biased journalism that goes against what they actually believe in. So they're okay with biased journalism, provided it's the biased journalism they like, but in general, they don't like it as an overall view. Now, sensationalism and intrigue obviously sells, and again, it's an incredibly intense competition between news groups, and again, all kinds of crazy things can happen. Here is a picture of Congressman, believe it or not, Congressman Weiner, who a few years ago ended up sending nude pictures of himself to his mistress, and it obviously went public. And Weiner's career was absolutely devastated as a result of the scandal. Okay, but again, it's sensationalism, and the fact that the guy's name is Weiner didn't help either. Okay, now, government constraints on journalists. We have a couple of things that they can actually ask for in state. You have on the record, and if a reporter asks for that, that means that they can actually quote the official by name. Okay, if it's off the record, they can say what the official says, but they can't actually use the name. So this is when you'll hear like a top White House aide said that this was actually happening. Okay, that would be off the record, but it's still regarded as viable information. Okay, you can actually have on background. This is what the official says can be used, but not attributed to him by her name or his name. Okay, so in other words, when we look on background, in other words, if an official said something specific, this is where they're essentially actually quoting the individual. And then you have on deep background, it's what an official says can be used but not attributed to anybody. And again, this is where you'll end up hearing an anonymous source says that such and such has actually done this. Okay, and again, this is where with Watergate we had Deep Throat, who was the deep background guy.